Let me introduce Ulises Mejías, who is director of the Institute for Global Engagement at the State University of New York, who is focusing on data colonialism and also decolonial strategies that could be employed in relation to technology, and who is an author of the book of the Network, Disrupting the Digital World, and also co-author with Nick Caldry of the book The Cost of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating it for Capitalism. And so we have Ulises' talk that would be about this concept of data colonialism, what's really behind this concept, and also about the border technologies as an example of this surveillance, but also colonial system, the example of data colonialism, and also some proposals, I guess, what kind of strategies we could employ to resist this system. So, Ulises, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here as part of the Biennale, and also my first time in Poland, which I'm enjoying very much. It's also good when you can see a lot of correspondences and connections between the different talks I've been listening to today. So hopefully this content will, as Bartosz said, fill some of the gaps. A lot of this work, it comes from, as was just mentioned, this book that I've co-authored with Nick Caldry, a colleague from the London School of Economics. Not to make this into a sales pitch, but there's a discount code if you want to order the book, which interestingly is published by Stanford University Press, the same evil Stanford that we just heard about. It's funny how historical cycles work. Maybe 50 years from now, this kind of event will be funded by the Mark Zuckerberg Foundation. So in this case, yes, this book is published by Stanford. But what we try to do in the book is answer what is seemingly a simple question. What is going on with data? I think it's a question a lot of us have been asking recently. And a lot of the proposals that we hear, people trying to make sense of what's going on with data, are centered on this notion that perhaps what we're seeing is a new form of colonialism. I'm sorry, a new form of capitalism. And of course, you might recognize some of these supposed new forms of capitalism. We have digital capitalism, informational capitalism, platform capitalism, most famously perhaps surveillance capitalism, the book by Susanna Zuboff, Data Capitalism, etc. What Nick and I are asking in our book is whether in fact what we're seeing is connected somehow to something even larger and older than just capitalism. We're talking essentially about this new intersection between two words that we usually don't put together, data and colonialism, right? Data is about the present, the future. Colonialism is about the past. How are we putting these two words together? We are essentially arguing that what we're seeing is a new chapter in the history of extractivism. And this allows us to do a couple of interesting things. For one thing, we can now start to look at what's happening with data and social media and the internet in a much longer history. It's not just about the last 40 years, perhaps, of the massification of the internet. We can perhaps put it in a history of 500 years of extractivism, so we can make sense of what is happening at a much larger scale. The second thing this allows us to do is also to not just focus on one thing, such, for instance, surveillance, or just focus on social media or artificial intelligence. Many of the current analysis that we see pick and choose by necessity in some of these things, but what we're interested in doing is sort of coming up with a meta theory of how all of these things are connected. The surveillance, the AI, the logistics, the information or the data that's being collected about health services, education services, even precision agriculture is becoming datafied, right? The application of robotics and artificial intelligence to agricultural practices. So again, we're trying to come up with a grand theory that connects all of it. And of course, when we start to use this word colonialism, I think the first response from many people is, well, surely you must mean this as a metaphor, as an allegory. There's nothing wrong with allegories, and they have enormous power of explanation. But in fact, we are saying that this is not just a metaphor. What we are seeing is an emerging reality, and we're using the word colonialism very intentionally. So, as you might have surmised by now, we are suggesting that we're experiencing a new phase of colonialism, what we're calling data colonialism. And much like the relationship between the older forms of colonialism and capitalism, we argue that this new form of colonialism is setting up the ground, the stage, for a new mode of capitalist production. Think about it this way. The wealth accumulated in colonialism at the plantations, at the mines, all of that wealth, accumulated wealth, is what financed the factories of industrial capitalism. So without the plantations, we wouldn't have the factories. So we're trying to think about this continuity and suggest that what we're seeing is kind of like a new unfolding of that same process. But of course, this is happening while coexisting with the legacy of neo-colonial violence that has existed also for 500 years. That legacy hasn't gone away. And that legacy, as we know, targets historically at-risk populations in terms of race, class, gender, also in terms of the environmental destruction. So we're not saying this new colonialism, we're starting from scratch. We're saying it's based on the older forms of violence that we have been seeing throughout. So at this point, let me sort of give you the official definition of what data colonialism is. We say that it's an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. So we're trying to be very careful in this definition. We are not saying all data is bad, and we should stop saying data. If you check the weather report this morning to see how hot it's going to be in Warsaw, you're using data. So data is useful. We are specifically talking about this kind of data extracted on a continuous basis from our lives for the explicit purpose of generating wealth or generating power for social control, perhaps. And I probably don't need to tell this audience how that process works. If we ask what is being extracted, well, every time we use our phones, every time we use our computers, our devices, and we connect to platforms, all that information, as has been discussed in previous presentations, is being extracted. Who is doing it? Yes, mostly it's big tech, those big corporations, although also smaller corporations. It's not just about Google and Apple and Facebook and Amazon and the Chinese counterparts. It's also smaller corporations. It's also data analytics firms, data brokerage firms. To what end? Well, supposedly to make life more convenient for us, to provide us services that are useful in our daily lives. But of course, as we start to think about the impact of all of this, we need only to look at the news reports from the last couple of years to read about disinformation and fake news and interference in elections. And as we also have heard today, alienation of workers, on and on and on. So we know that this process is not a neutral thing that's going on, right? Now, as I'm describing this new form of colonialism, obviously you might be thinking this has nothing to do with historical colonialism. And it's true, we want to keep in mind all of the differences. We are not making a one-to-one comparison. We are not saying this colonialism is exactly the same as the older one. There are differences in terms of the modes, the intensities. There are differences in terms of the scales, the context. Colonialism in Mexico did not look the same as colonialism in India, or perhaps the internal colonialism of Russia. All of these things are very different. We want to keep those differences in mind. At the same time, we're saying that all those forms of colonialism and data colonialism have one very important similarity. And that similarity is the historical function. That function is to dispossess, to extract. That's what colonialism is all about, right? So whether we're comparing the older ones or the new form of colonialism, they all have that basic function, to extract and to dispossess. So in some ways, we're sort of we're starting a conversation between colonialism and capitalism to reinforce this point, that without colonialism, there would be no capitalism. So that continuity is important to keep in mind. So in the book, what we do is we talk about the coloniality of data relations. I'll talk a little bit more about data relations in a little bit. But basically what we're doing is setting up trans-historical comparisons, using the past to try to understand the present. And we organize them in terms of the 4X model. I don't know if there are any gamers in the room, but this 4X model is what you apply when you're playing strategy video games, such as the one you see in the background here. This is basically Colonialism, the video game. It's part of Sid Meier's Civilization series. And so this 4X model basically means explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. That's kind of like the playbook for colonialism, right? And it's what you do here in this video game as well. So in the book, we organize all of these continuities along this model. Right now, I don't have time to do all of them. Let's just briefly look at one example from Explore. And what I want to do here is basically compare two documents. The first one, in case you haven't read it, like most of us, is from Google Chrome's Terms of Service. I'll let you read it yourselves here. But basically, as you can see, when you install Google Chrome, you give Google permission to do all of these things. It's pretty expansive, right? They can reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, blah, 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 everything that you do through their services. I want to compare this to a much older document. This document was called the Requerimiento. And this document was read by Spanish conquistadors when they were about to enter a city or a village in the so-called New World to conquer it. And many times they would arrive in the middle of the night under cover of darkness. They would stand outside of the city limits, and they would proceed to read this document in Spanish to an audience that didn't speak Spanish. It reminded me of the worker statements that Taylor had the workers read. And the document said, in part, I'm going to read here, if you do not submit to Spanish rule, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command, and we shall take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. That's the Spanish Requerimiento 1513. Please click accept and install. The point here is not that what happened after the Requerimiento was read is the same thing that happens after you install Google Chrome. Hopefully Google won't come along and take away your wives and your children, hopefully. But what we're pointing out here is the use of this abstract language that people don't understand to carry out this initial process of extraction, right? Just as we don't read the terms of service of all of these tools that we use, and even if we try to read them, we don't understand them because they are essentially in a foreign tongue. All right, don't want to bore you too much with Marxist stuff, but in the book we do talk about Marx a little bit. Because, of course, you know, if we're talking about capitalism, you need to understand sort of his critique of capitalism. But what's interesting is that, of course, to Marx, everything could be understood through labor relations. And those continue to be important. Today, I'm not saying they are no longer important. But in our book, we argue that this emerging social order cannot be understood primarily through labor relations. We need a new concept, which we call data relations. which are basically the ways of reproducing social life and configuring social interactions to optimize this process of data extraction for profit. And here, if you're interested, we use the work of Moise Poston, which is kind of useful, and it allows us to reinterpret Marx in an important way, because he says that the fundamental characteristic of capitalism, sorry, the rest of the quote is missing there, but it's not so much commodification, but abstraction. In capitalism, what matters is that you can take life processes, you can take the stuff of life and abstract it, make something else out of it that then can be commodified. And basically that's what data does, right? It takes things, it allows corporations to take things from our life and commodify them, so that ordinary social life becomes a direct factor of capitalist production. And so that human life is then annexed to capitalism through continuous monitoring and influence and surveillance, what we're calling surveillance here. All right. To sort of explain this from another perspective, one of the reasons this new emerging order of data colonialism is very effective is because the rationalities to justify it are based on basically colonial models of thinking. So these new rationalities have their roots in very old forms of rationality. So let me sort of explain that by starting with the concept of cheap nature. In order to colonize the world, the colonizers had to frame nature as something cheap. What do we mean by that? It was supposed to be abundant. Nature was said to be free. It was just there for the taking. That's what allowed colonizers to show up half of the world and say, look at all of this land, isn't it great? It's free, it's there for the taking. Now it belongs to me. They used a very specific legal concept called terra nullius, which some of you might have heard of, no man's land in Latin. Yeah, this land doesn't have an owner. Of course, most of that land was inhabited by people, but guess what? Those people were not full human beings in the eyes of the colonizers, right? So that's what allowed them to take over all of this nature because it was supposed to be cheap. The next step in that process is, of course, cheap labor. In order to take all of that nature and transform it into wealth, you need labor, you need human labor. And so again, the colonizers framed that labor as cheap, abundant, free. Of course, in colonialism, this was a very racialized system. Certain human races, they were seen as their job was basically to provide this labor for free as slaves or as lowly paid workers. And of course, this was all presented as progress. This was all presented as something good for humanity, right? In many cases, it was presented as a civilizational enterprise. Those people were barbarians, so the colonizers were civilizing them. So notice how we go from this concept of cheap nature to cheap labor, and of course now we have cheap data. And if you think about it, cheap data has many of the same characteristics of cheap nature and cheap labor. It is said to be free, it is said to be abundant, it's said to be there just for the taking. It's also said to be ownerless. Now you and I produce it, so initially we are the owners, but by the time it gets aggregated, it takes a very particular kind of corporation with advanced technology to turn it into something useful. Think of oil. Oil was thought about in the same way, right? It's just a natural resource, but you and I can't do anything with it. We need refineries. And so only the corporations with that technology can turn something that is an exhaust, something free, abundant, and turn it into something useful. So we can see how cheap data sort of follows this progression of something cheap. And so what I want to do in the second half of the talk is to look at how cheap data devalues the lives of migrants. So look at what's happening around the world with some of these processes of migration and the ways in which data and technology are being used. And so here, I have a couple of points that I want to make. The first one is that this datafication of the border, all of these digital and smart borders, help to create, as we know, anti-migrant sentiments. At best, they are presented as a form of techno-humanitarianism, because in this context, yes, migrants are seen as vulnerable individuals that perhaps need protection, but at the same time, they are seen as security threats. Something, or people that must be monitored in some way. Their movement needs to be controlled. That is at best. At worst, of course, what we're seeing is this data, this technology is used to criminalize migrants and to sort of externalize the border so that it's not something that happens just in certain geographic zones, but that it's spread out to other parts. The US has a pretty bad record in terms of this, as you might have seen in the news. If we look at what's happening along the US-Mexico border, we're seeing separation of families. We are seeing asylum seekers escaping violence in Latin America being returned to, their original countries, where sometimes they are murdered. We are seeing tear gassing of migrants and even just caging children in desert encampments as they are removed from their parents. And what's interesting is that the application of all of these technologies, really, if you think about it, it has support from both sides of the political spectrum. This is not just something that the rights, the conservatives are doing, because even the left sees it as a gentler and smarter alternative. It's like, okay, let's not build Trump's wall, but let's build a digital wall because it will be better. It's smarter, it's better, it's safer. That's the narrative from the left side of the spectrum. The second point about cheap data and borders is that digital or smart borders are lethal. Basically, they are costing real human lives. And here I just want to point to one study, an empirical study from Northrop Chambers, where, quote, he says there is a significant correlation between the location of border surveillance technology, the routes taken by migrants, and the localizations of recovered human remains in Arizona. If you think about it, it makes sense. If you put up a bunch of surveillance cameras, it's going to force migrants to move to other points to cross the border that are more dangerous, more remote, so people are dying as a result of that. And the last point here, as an overview, is that these digital smart borders are not properly regulated. Yes, we're seeing a lot of influx of technology, but right now it's not really regulated. We're seeing adoption of experimental tools, which can be quite dangerous. And of course, we're seeing an over-reliance on the private sector. This is not just something that states are doing, it is something that states are doing with the help of private companies. Just as an example that has already been mentioned a couple of times, Palantir comes to mind. This graph might be a little bit small for you to read, but it's a flow chart that tracks the connections between people who work at Palantir, including the CEO, and the Trump family and members of his administration. So there are very clear connections there. So we have to keep in mind the role of the private sector, these blurred lines between public, private, military, civilian partnerships, all of these companies that are creating these technologies to surveil, militarize the borders. And of course, all of this is resulting in incredible, profitable contracts for companies like Palantir, but also companies like Amazon that hosts in its cloud many of these services, Salesforce, Microsoft, Dell, Hewlett-Packard, you mentioned. Even companies like Clearview, which have been demonstrated to have pretty explicit connections to white supremacists. So these are the companies sort of providing the technological framework for this to happen. So what I want to do is sort of divide a quick overview of some of these technologies and divide it by looking at what happens before migrants cross the border, what happens at the border, and what happens after they cross the border. Before crossing, we're already seeing all sorts of applications of artificial intelligence. For instance, in reviewing applications, which is something very similar to what's happening in the job market. These days, when you apply for a job, you know that an AI agent is going to look at your resume before a human being does. The same kind of technologies are being applied in the review of refugee applications, visa applications, even in the cases of migrant detention. So that's one thing. Of course, the borders themselves are being heavily monitored and surveilled. One example of this is the European Union's Row Border project, which, as they say, it aims to provide a fully functional autonomous border surveillance systems with basically drones, air, water, and surface drones. We're already seeing a lot of that happening. And even all sorts of different surveillance efforts in refugee camps. We have lots of biometrics going on. In some of the camps in Greece, for instance, with iris scanning. So in order for refugees, if they want to eat, they have to submit to these kinds of scanning. Even financial monitoring. In many of these camps, refugees get financial assistance in the form of like a credit card kind of thing with money on it. But of course, then that means all of their transactions are followed. And of course, those cards stop working if the refugee leaves the camp. So it's also a nice way to kind of keep people concentrated in one area. Parenthetically, I think we do also need to take into account sort of the role of social media in border crossing, because we're seeing lots of TikTok accounts, Instagram accounts of people who document their process of crossing the border, sometimes creating perhaps unrealistic expectations. In some cases, it's been documented. Some of these people basically get paid by the coyotes, the people whose job it is to help migrants cross the border. So it's kind of like a form of advertising. States are trying to take some of that content down, but it's difficult because in many cases it's also free expression, right? I mean, migrants want to document their experiences as well. Anyway, so all of this is happening even before migrants cross the border. What's happening at the borders? Of course, biometrics, surveillance, the visa information system, which is perhaps the largest migration-related database in the world, which we all go through every time we travel and cross a border. So we have all of these databases. And what's happening here, it's interesting because it's sort of moving from just a process where you get at the border and present your passport and someone checks it and they decide whether you can pass or not, to this new process of what people are calling identity management, where basically, you are not as important as what your biometric data says about you, because your biometric data can't lie. So the assumption is that you don't even need to say anything when crossing a border. When I go back to the United States, all I need to do is show my face, which gets scanned, and then the government already knows everything it needs to know about me. So I don't even need to talk to a border agent. We're also seeing artificial intelligence applied in lie detection systems. So perhaps cameras that monitor people's responses to try to detect whether they are lying as they're trying to cross a border. Tracking, of course, is very prevalent and widely used. Again, the use of drones all over the place, but also different kinds of systems such as license plate recognition, all sorts of remote and mobile video surveillance systems. Some of these technologies are incredible, and they can detect individuals up to 6 miles away, day or night. Of course, a lot of these processes are being automated, so again, there's no human being at least at the initial point. So they're autonomous surveillance systems with no human intervention, at least at some points. And then, of course, there's a lot of hacking and confiscation. Of course, authorities at borders are interested in looking at your phones, if it's protected, of course, then in hacking your phone. There are companies selling very extensive vehicle forensic kits, which basically look at the car's navigation system or entertainment system to get data about where that car has been. And of course, I have here a list of states that already have phone confiscation, phone seizure laws that apply to asylum or migration applicants. So if you're trying to seek asylum or migrate across a border, you can, certain states now have legal power to just confiscate your phone. All right, what's happening after people manage to cross borders? More technology being applied here. An important point is that, of course, we can, as we can expect to see, COVID is being used as an excuse to augment the role of technology here. Of course, now we have virus-killing robots that go along sanitizing surfaces, but they are also capable of capturing information about people. Of course, we had the whole debate about contact tracing apps. Google and Apple supposedly coming forth to solve COVID-19 by creating these apps. Of course, it didn't work the way they thought it would work. But of course, as you might have heard, thermal cameras have also become very prevalent in taking images of people who might have a fever. And of course, those cameras are also being used against migrants, or are also being used at border points. As I have in the picture here, ankle bracelets have become a big thing, which some people call a prison without walls. So the idea is that instead of you spending time in detention, the government's going to put an ankle bracelet that will monitor your location. And of course, in many cases, at least in the United States, you have to pay for it. So basically, you have to pay for your own device that's going to track you. It's about $300. I forget if it's a month or maybe a one-time fee. Sorry, I forgot. These are very sophisticated technologies. Obviously, they not only track location, they have microphones. They're capable of recording conversations. The data from these devices is being used to conduct raids, for instance, to catch more immigrants. The idea is that now, if I have a bracelet, it's expected that I'm going to go hang out with other people who might have crossed the border illegally, and so then authorities can just show up and arrest all of them. Which brings us to the fact that a lot of this data is being abused. So in just one case, of course, we've heard about Palantir's ICM system, which was used to target and arrest family members of children who crossed the US border alone and needed sponsors. So families were being separated, kids were being put in detention centers, and so then family members or friends stepped up and said, I want to sponsor this child. Using Palantir's system, they could then sort of get more information about the people who wanted to sponsor children, and in many cases, then those people were arrested, which is not at all the scope of what the data was supposed to be used for. By the way, I just read in the news that the UK is going to start experimenting with this kind of electronic tags, these bracelets. So it's not just in the US, and we can expect to see it everywhere soon. Okay, sorry, the font is not showing there. But I wanted to just make the point briefly, to go back to the point about colonialism, that data has always been central to the enterprise, to the project of colonialism, and to the project of border control. Data was already important in historical colonialism via technologies of administration. So if you think about the creation of maps, the creation of surveys, even modern accounting methods such as spreadsheets, they all have colonial histories, right? All of these technologies were used in that context. Of course, we have data used for purposes of containment. The passport itself, you can say it's an invention of colonialism as it tracked movement of people across borders. Same thing with vaccination cards. There's a very long history about hygiene and colonialism that we won't get into right now, but also the creation of plague towns, etc. And of course, data was always very important in the task of policing bodies as they cross borders. Fingerprinting, I don't know if you knew this, was actually a technology invented in India. in the colonies, and then that technology was exported to the rest of the empire. But it had its roots in India as a technology of tracking people, tracking the movement of certain kinds of people. Phenotyping, perhaps an earlier precursor of facial recognition. In general, just biometrics has always had a very close history to colonialism. And of course, all of this has very particular colonial echoes, which is the point of our argument, right? To try to trace these continuities. I mean, this picture seems like it might have been taken 100 years ago, but it was just taken last year along the US border. And here, I think a couple of points we need to keep in mind. It has always been the case that technology can cross borders, but humans can't. Yeah, as we saw with the example of fingerprinting. And in many cases, border communities are treated as the test subjects for this generalized surveillance. So these surveillance measures and technologies are first tested in the borders, then they move to other places. In other words, what starts in the colonies can later be imported to the metropolis, and this has applications well beyond just migration. These days, we're going through a crisis in the United States about abortion, and so some people are starting to get worried about how data can be used in that context as well. So CNN had a report on how personal data can be used to enforce anti-abortion laws. And so basically they're talking about applying the same technologies, geofencing and all of that, could potentially be used to track people, perhaps who are seeking abortions in other states, etc. One interesting case I also read about is smart water meters. The meter in your house that tracks how much water you're using. Of course, now those devices are smart, which means they collect data and send it to a company. And these devices can basically determine if there is a pregnant woman in your household just by the patterns of water use. So, your water meter could potentially, report you if it detects a pregnancy didn't go through the full term. So I know this is kind of Orwellian stuff, but we've been there before, and we're starting to see that, unfortunately, these things can happen, can become reality more frequently than we can admit. All right, just to wrap it up, because I think, a lot of this information can be depressing, and so we often are asked, okay, what can we do about it? How can we decolonize data? In this case specifically, how can we decolonize border data? So in our work, we have started to think about it. Of course, these are big problems, right? If we are connecting this process to colonialism, to 500 years of colonialism, this is not something we're going to solve next week or next year. So we need to think long term. And we need to also think perhaps in terms of strategies that activists in Latin America have thought about, multi-track strategies of working within, against, and without the status quo. Because I think it's important sometimes, from an artistic perspective, perhaps to think about strategies in opposition to the system, but we have to remember that we also have to work within the system if we want to get things done. So let's start there and working within the status quo. And so here, I think we can just focus on traditional politics. I think the electing politicians makes a difference, even if they're not perfect, as no politician ever is. I think it's important to participate in electoral politics, in the kinds of referendums, to pass laws that are favorable to migrants and to society in general. Working within the system might mean also perhaps regulation, putting pressure on our governments to make sure that they pass appropriate regulation, antitrust regulations, so that big tech companies don't get too big, but also what is called ex post or ex ante regulation. So these are the kinds of regulations that regulate, for instance, an algorithm after it's been released and after the damage is done. That's ex post regulation. But we also need to focus on ex ante regulation. How do we put rail guards in place so that even before algorithms are designed, they have to abide by certain rules. They have to follow certain procedures. Just like we have cars that supposedly have to meet certain pollution standards even before the car is manufactured. So regulation is very important. We're starting to see how people are fighting within corporations as well. So we have some voices of dissent within companies like Amazon and Facebook and Google. Many times those voices pay a heavy price. We've seen people who get fired for speaking up, but we're also seeing successful attempts of organizing and of workers at Microsoft, for instance, saying you can't use the data, the products that we're building, we don't want them to be used this particular way. So that's something important. Perhaps we need to pay more attention to impact assessments, which is already a process for determining the impact of technologies. It's used widely when determining environmental impacts. Maybe we can also use them to determine algorithmic impact, for instance. And of course, participating in education campaigns, literacy campaigns, changing the way we prepare our engineers, for instance. Many of us in academia can see that our engineering programs are they lack sometimes knowledge of the humanities and of critical thinking. So I think those are things we can do even within our institutions. Prepare engineers differently. But of course, working within the system always represents challenges. There are always limits to it. Because at the end of the day, states, more often than not, align themselves with corporations. They did that through colonialism as well, so it's not a new thing. So we have to watch out for that. And that's why it's important to also work against the status quo, against the system. And so here, of course, it's very important, the politics, the aesthetics of resistance, how to resist some of these things. We've seen wonderful examples at this event of some of those strategies. More broadly, I think we need to reject this universalism of data collection, this idea that corporations are always entitled to collect any data that they want. I think this is a way of thinking that we need to start challenging. How might we do that? Perhaps by applying the same strategies that other decolonial movements have applied in terms of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That has worked somewhat well in the case of Palestine, for instance, and the activists there. And the larger point here is that we can learn from other decolonial movements. There are people who have very rich histories of resisting colonialism. Their struggles many times are not our struggles, and in fact we might be seen as the enemy by some of those movements, but the point here is that we need to establish new forms of solidarity and learn from them. And yes, it's important to just reject the whole thing. And so I think this is where the politics of non-alignment are very important. Just like we have to work within the system, we also have to imagine what the outside of the system might look like. So the politics of non-alignment are very important here. I think we need to reclaim colonized space and time. The space colonized by cameras, by digital assistants in our homes, in our bedrooms, the time colonized by our use of all of these devices. Of course, there are lots of examples of alternative technologies, and we can have a whole discussion about open source and all of that, which I support, but it also is problematic sometimes. And so I think we need to participate in more radical forms of education and literacy. Yes, education and literacy can be done also within the system, but I think they need to be done outside as well. They need to become more radical. All of this, I think, we need to do by using one very important tool in the fight against colonialism, and that is imagination. When colonialism couldn't be resisted with the body, it could always be resisted with the mind. Because first and foremost, colonialism colonizes the mind. It colonizes our way of thinking. And so perhaps a way out of this is also to think creatively about how we disconnect from some of these technologies, but also how we find new ways of connection beyond the platforms that we use. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ulises, for the wonderful talk. And I think that again we have like some links with some works at the exhibition, and also with the title, because the title "Seeing Stones" is of course the reference to Palantir, because the Seeing Stones were Palantirs from Lord of the Rings. So, and there's also a work by Louis Craven that is about Anduril, that has a direct relation to your talk, because Anduril is the company. The Anduril is also the name taken from Tolkien. Anduril was the sword of Aragorn. It was also called the Flame of the West. And Anduril is a startup, is a company that produces hardware and software to protect borders, like surveillance towers, like some drones, some also underwater vehicles, and they've got their own AI system to automate this surveillance of the border. And it's also super relevant to our like current local context, because what is now happening at the Polish-Belarusian border, we just have like a large part of the wall constructed, because we have the wall being built at the border, like almost 200 kilometers of the wall. And now what is being installed on this wall is so-called perimetry. So perimetry is like this digital border that is now part also of this wall. And there were some articles about the wall and about the digital border, but still we don't know how it is going to work, like how exactly it will be designed. What we know from our experience, also from the border from the beginning of this year, we've got like many thermovision traps in forests. We've got drones that are like surveilling the space all the time, the territory all the time. We've got also like this taking appropriating like the smartphones of immigrants to check to destroy them on one hand, because they've got this like digital trace that could be used then against border guard, for instance, because they save the evidence of pushbacks that are now on a regular basis. They are happening every day on the border. So I think it's like something that is super like actual and super relevant also to the current like local context. It's something we are like thinking about, have been thinking about a lot right now. So about like this algorithmic aspect, but also of this surveillance aspect, and also what you mentioned about testing, new technologies on immigrants. That it's like this super vulnerable group that is somehow beyond the law, as it's treated as being beyond the law, so you can test like new technologies on them to then export them to what you call metropolis or to the polis, and that could be used on a daily basis also in relation to citizens. So that's, I think, like super relevant. I think it's super important aspect to discuss, and maybe it was just a commentary, not a question to you, because I really like the strategies that you proposed here. But maybe you can also like propose something. Maybe you have something in mind that could be added to this, and I think it could be very interesting conversation how we could find about decolonizing like border technologies, but also like this colonial technologies with which we are like in constant relationships every day. So yeah, let's open the conversation.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have one question regarding this postulate of non-alignment, the politics of non-alignment. we know this idea from the non-alignment movement of, from the 60s and 70s. Could you tell more about this new idea of non-alignment? What do you mean? How it can look like in the field of technology?
Sure, you're right to point out that connection, because that's exactly what I had in mind, and that's exactly what's motivated some of us in trying to start to conceptualize what a new non-aligned technologies movement might look like. So just for a little bit of historical context, during the Cold War, many nations, especially in the global South, they didn't like the choice that was being presented to them. They said, we don't agree with capitalism on the one hand, and we don't agree with communism on the other. So we need a third space. So that's where the non-aligned movement came from. It was very much a state response, and of course there were states, many here in Eastern Europe and Africa. And so we have been thinking of a way to kind of update that same concept, because clearly many of us do not feel we can line ourselves with the profit-based model of Silicon Valley on the one hand, nor with the social control model of the Communist Chinese Party. So again, we need to define this new space. What that might look like, I think it's still to be determined. Of course, just in terms of the use of technologies, we have many platforms and options available. I think in some cases it might just be as easy as just saying, well, let's all use open source software, right? Of course, it's not as simple as that. Many corporations and many governments are already using open source software. So it's not like there's something magical about open source that will solve problems automatically. We have to remember, for instance, the largest operating system for phones, it's an open source system, Android, and that doesn't stop the extractivism from happening. So, but I think the idea here is that, yes, building an international movement where the response can be not just local, but global, connecting these different movements who want to reject those two options and come up with an alternative. I think that's what we're thinking about. And of course, that's already being done, so we're not the first ones to come along and propose it. But I think so far it's kind of happening at the local level. Communities are starting to organize and respond to some of these issues. I know there was an earlier question about other forms of algorithmic rebellion, and the thing that came to mind, for instance, is the Indigenous data sovereignty movement. So First Nations communities all over the world saying, we don't want the old models, we don't want people to come to our communities and collect data and leave. We want to collect our own data, analyze our own data, and conceptualize what data is for in our own way. So I think, we're starting to see those opportunities for resistance. I think the challenge is going to be to connect all of us, so that perhaps we can see a more global movement emerging out of this.
Yeah, that question was so good in your response that I had to follow up. I was just sort of thinking through it with you, and I had a couple of thoughts. There's a certain kind of globalist politics that's being led not just by Western, kind of techno-capitalism, but also by the Chinese, right? The Chinese-Russian relationship is very important because of the border, and control over Eurasia has always kind of entailed sort of global control. If you look historically, the U.S. had managed to manipulate a lot of that over the last 50 years. So, I know you're familiar with the Chinese Silk Road Initiative and the One Belt, One Road Initiative, which has about 65 countries involved actively and over 100 involved just in relations of exchange. So I'm wondering how you situate that relative to your discussions of coloniality. That's part one. And then I always have two questions. I don't know why. But the other is, when we look at social movements that kind of start at the grassroots and globalize, we have seen examples of this recently We saw it with Black Lives Matter. We saw it with Occupy. And I think it's quite different, but we see the South American turn to the left, right? Going all the way up to Mexico. I mean, different ways, right? With the Colombian election that just occurred. I used to do fieldwork in Bolivia. There's a lot, at least it's rhetorically, discursively kind of non-aligned maybe, but do you think that's BS, or I'm curious what you think about all that?
Okay, thanks. Yes, those are great points. As far as China, yeah, in the book we do make a very clear case that we cannot just ignore China, and in fact, the way we're thinking about data colonialism, we're thinking about these two poles. On the one hand, Silicon Valley, and on the other, the Chinese Communist Party. Because the counterparts, I mean, I think in the Western media, we always talk about Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, but of course, their Chinese counterparts are just as powerful. If we think about Alibaba and Tencent and Xiaomi and Baidu, so these companies, so we have to pay attention. And so, and of course, China is also interesting when it comes to this discussion of colonialism, because like Russia is perhaps an example of like internal colonialism. You know, they didn't go out that much and colonize other parts of the world, but internally, you know, they did. And so we can see what's happening with the Uyghur community as an example of, you know, very datafied and high-tech way of closing off an entire ethnic minority in what some people are calling a genocide. Right, but it's very much aided by technology. So, you know, the biometrics that are being collected on the Uyghur population, there's this databases, probably some of the most extensive of, you know, DNA of every Uyghur, you know, civilian. And then the whole, you know, tracking movement and GPS. And so I think that's a clear example of a nightmare of what can happen when these technologies are applied to oppress one specific population. Unfortunately, the Chinese are doing that very well. But yes, this is very much a global story. And so to the second part of your question, it is encouraging to see what some countries are doing. Of course, you know, Brazil is often an example that's mentioned where it had very progressive, at least in the previous administration. I'm not talking about the present administration. The previous administration have very progressive policies for dealing with data and sharing and all of that. And then, of course, you know, we see what's happening now, which, by the way, I thought it was a very photogenic moment, the handshake between Elon Musk and Bolsonaro, right? Making a deal where Elon Musk, and what's interesting is the rationality behind that. So Elon Musk is going to provide internet for 17,000 schools and data imaging for the Amazon. So it sounds very humanitarian and great, but of course we know what's behind all of that if he's shaking hands with the devil. But you know, Brazil was very important in the non-aligned movement, and other countries might be. I mean, it's interesting also to see how in India this language of data colonialism resonates, I would say for the wrong reasons in some cases, because there also the idea is we have to kick out the external influences so that we can oppress our own populations internally without impediment. And so India is also another interesting example of what's going on. But I think the difference here between this non-aligned movement is the non-aligned technologies movement is that it would have to be not just state-based or state-initiated. I think the next non-aligned movement needs to come from us, from civil society, from activists, from educators. And so, for instance, another plug is for another network. Nick Coldry and Paula Ricarte in Mexico started called tierracomún.net, and so that's an activist network and an academic network of people in Latin America interested in these kinds of issues. So I think we're starting to see some of these responses, which hopefully can provide a counterbalance to what states are doing.
Thanks a lot for the beautiful talk. I have another question, like thinking of data colonialism, there's obviously always two sides to data. I mean, there's the digital, the binary, but also like the physical, the hardware side to it. And thinking also about the more physical infrastructural qualities of data colonialism. I wonder if you tackled some of those topics in your book. I'm thinking of the internet cables running along routes that have been colonial trade routes earlier, but also thinking about server farms that basically need a lot of energy, and then the carbon footprint of those basically affecting mainly countries in the global south. And I think there is high frequency trading, and how I know milliseconds in differences in internet speed might affect the whole financial sector. So I think there's like really a lot of examples also on the infrastructural qualities inside of this topic, and I wonder what is the forefront? I could imagine maybe it needs a strategy that comes from like the software and the hardware side, because obviously there's always this dualism happening, and it doesn't really work to only think on one side of this dualist thing. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, firstly, that's one of the things I really loved about your presentation, that anecdote about the history of the sites in California. So if we think about those continuities between Spanish missions, which decimated the populations, and then those sites became, the sites where manufacturing was done, and pollution and all of that. I might have to borrow that story, because I think that's a very clear example of discontinuities. Once we start to scratch under the surface, I think we can trace back what's happening all the way to colonialism. One example we do mention in the book, for instance, is the fact that in Brazil, the telegraph, the rifle, and the cross arrived at the same time in many of the First Nation communities in Brazil. So, in other words, religion, communication technology, and weapons to enforce, to put down resistance, they were all part of the same package. Yeah. And I think we can extrapolate and continue to see those correspondences. As far as whether it should be more of a software, hardware solution, I think we need to try everything, including disconnection, including solutions that don't have anything to do with hardware and software and data. So I think it's important to pursue all avenues at this point. So we're not about saying stop using Facebook. If Facebook can be used by activists, then why not? As long as you understand sort of the implications of using Facebook, because people did use Facebook for activism during the Arab Spring, and that made it easier for the authorities to come and arrest you. So, but sometimes those tools can be important, and we do need to be realistic about the fact that we cannot, and I think this is also a little bit of the critique of open source that I have, and of peer-to-peer and blockchain and all of that, that sometimes it's presented as a world without money built on top of a world where money is everything. So we cannot really create our own internet without at some point having to rely on some of these corporations, even to provide the hardware, even to provide the cables, the routers. So I think we're still a long way to go from being able to manufacture my own phone using materials I find in my backyard. That's not going to happen. So we are implicated in the system, and I think that's the point of data colonialism too, that it creates structures that are so wide, so global, and so comprehensive that they do look impossible to resist at many times. And just to end on a more positive note, because I think it's true, as even Vlad got that question of what do we do, right? Isn't this too pessimistic, too fatalistic? I think here I would like to end with Antonio Gramsci's point that there should be pessimism of the intellect, but an optimism of the will. I think our job is to critique the system, even if it's presented in a fatalistic way, but always have that optimism to believe that things can be changed and there's something perhaps we cannot change the entirety of the system, but perhaps we can focus on the little things that we can in fact change. That's my attempt at optimism.